Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carl Fredrickson, and I'm the publisher of Speedway Illustrated. It certainly is a highlight for me to join each of you welcoming such a distinguished group of honorees today. And I have the distinct privilege to talk for a few minutes about one of racing's real gentlemen, Pete Falconi. You know, my training is as a journalist, and I learned from the best: Dick Berggren, Bones Borsier, Lou Boyd, many others, people in this room. And they all instilled an important aspect to being a journalist, and that is you have to know your subject. You got to get to know them. As such, I asked Pete to join me to dinner, where I'd get to learn a little bit more about the famous Falconi racing family. Pete said his father, John, was working on the race car the night that he got a call saying that it was time to bring his mother, Nancy, to the hospital because she had the important job of delivering Pete. Eventually, John owned and operated the Westboro Speedway and promoted Brookline, New Hampshire, and at Thompson, Connecticut. And while his brothers grew up to own, drive, build winning race cars, it was the colorful flags that always had young Pete's attention. By age 9 at Westboro, he was setting the flags in place before the event got started. You may, if you were at Westboro, you know that the flag stand, the starter's box, is about an inch from the speedway. So young Pete would scurry behind the chain link, and the warm-ups would get underway. But in 1965, Chief Starter Walt Faulkner had a brilliant idea: have the child flag a heat race. An 11-year-old Pete Falconi thought that was a genius idea. And amazingly, the race went without interruption or concern. Father John, however, happened to saunter out of the office and saw his young son flagging the races as the cars went whizzing by, and got pretty animated at the display in front of him. He promptly turned his son around and sent him in the other direction, to the announcer's tower. Pete didn't like that at all, because Pete had been flagging the street races around there for kids on their bicycles around their Southborough, Massachusetts home, and he thought flagging was his future. But when he did go up there, he joined veteran announcer Bill Welch, and he took hold of that microphone and talked his way right into this Hall of Fame. Mr. Welch was perfect for Pete. He hung on his mentor's every word. Among them, Welchie told the young charge, avoid making villains out of people. And remember, racetracks don't have corners, they have turns. Pete's brilliance with the microphone was clear early on. He was working in radio before he even graduated from high school. And at the local radio station, Pete said, I was just mostly hanging around doing light gigs, trying to find a way to be an asset. But soon he was off to college. And of course, he pursued a career, a degree in communications. But he got a call, and the call was from the radio station. They had a full-time job that opened up, and they offered it to Pete. He said, well, you know what? I'll just skip this college stuff for now, and as soon as this runs out, I'll go back to school. Well, the school is still waiting. Pete became a popular DJ in Boston, and he now owns and operates 5 radio stations in New Hampshire and Maine. Weekends, however, have always been for racing. In those early years, Pete called the action at Westboro and Seekonk alongside Wally Saliba, and he also called races at Stafford, again with his mentor Welch and Mike Joy. So if you've been to a race in New England in the past 5 decades, you've probably heard his voice. He's the traveling announcer of NEMA for 19 years. And he's been calling races for those in the grandstands at New Hampshire Motor Speedway since the mid-1990s. That 25 years might make him the longest tenured employee at that track. And remember that station that Pete used to hang around as a teenager? Jean McGrath worked there. She and the rest of her family would go to Westboro to watch the races. And that's where her young son, David, fell in love with the sport. Today, we know him as the Executive Vice President and General Manager of New Hampshire Motor Speedway. And there's no doubt that Pete's race call helped cultivate McGrath's love of motorsport, like so many in this room and at racetracks around New England. That's what Pete brings to the announcer's role. He's told me the announcer is the line between fans and what's happening on the track. His job is to make sure people have a story to tell from their day at the races, especially if it's a first-time visitor. Yet for all his experience and expertise in all facets of racing, I'll bet your experience with Pete is a lot like mine, because I cannot ever recall him complaining or criticizing a racetrack. So I asked him about that at the dinner. And he said, they didn't hire me as a consultant. So I thought that was pretty good. But there was something else from that dinner that he told me that I just got to share. And he said this quite casually, I might add. He said, you know, I never wanted to see him crash. So wait, what? Isn't that announcer catnip? Isn't that when tumbling chassis and bent body panels, isn't that what drives these announcers? Maybe some, but not Pete Falconi. That simple sentence, I never wanted to see him crash. That, to me, is his essence. This brilliant performer, Pete Falconi, is a consummate gentleman. You know, I never wanted to see him crash. This is what made Pete Falconi a tremendous announcer and so worthy of his induction into the Hall today. His focus and enthusiasm for auto racing was on the competition, not the carnage. You know, I never wanted to see him crash. So how about a big hand for Pete Falconi as he comes to the podium and joins a near Hall of Fame in perpetuity.
Thank you, Carl. I really appreciate it. I'm a big fan. His magazine comes in the mail, and before even dinner, I sit down and get through about 3/4 of it. I'm thrilled to have him induct me into the Hall of Fame. It's so hard for me to fathom because all my heroes in racing, all these years, are in this Hall of Fame. It's truly amazing to me that I'm receiving this honor. Truly the pinnacle of my life. What's unusual about this, though, is when I'm announcing races, usually everybody's facing the other way looking at the racetrack. So if you don't mind all turning around, this will be a little easier for me to do because normally I'm looking at the back of everybody's head. But I need to begin by thanking NEAR, nominating selection committees, all those involved with New England Antique Racers that do just a fine job of preserving the history of the sport that we grew up with and love so dearly, not just this event, but all year long. I especially want to thank my wife, Patricia, for allowing me to do all this racing from April to October on Saturday nights and Sundays, and sometimes, in the case of Loudon, 3 days away from home for the races. She knew my lifelong passion for the sport when we met, and she's been very supportive. Thank you, Patricia. I need to thank my family, my full family involvement in this racing. My late brothers, John and Rick, who are here in spirit today. My brother, Jimmy, who, along with nephews John and Jamie, all have been drivers, race car builders, owners, and mechanics, and I've learned so much about that side of racing from those guys. I need to thank all the announcers that I get to work with when traveling to various tracks throughout the season now that I do all the races for the Northeastern Midget Association. My colleagues and fellow inductee John Spence from Lee, Dave Sutherland from Monadnock, Joe Koss at Loudon, Ken Minot at Wiscasset, who I'm happy to see here today, Tyler Morse at Star, Kevin Boucher at Seekonk, Dave Barabal at the Waterford Speed Bowl, and especially Matt Buckler, who I'm sorry he wasn't here today as the usual MC of this event. I work alongside Matt doing the announcing duties at Thompson, and I've learned a lot from him too. Like, for instance, a 2-car length lead is the length of a school bus. I think he likes to use that phrase all the time. I also want to thank those legendary announcers that I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, and proud to have shared the announcers booth with, guys that I learned a lot from in racing, including the great Ken Squire at Loudon, Mike Joy when we worked together at Stafford, Jack Arute, Ben Dodge, Al Robinson, even all the way back to my beginning days with Wally Saliba at Seekonk. I was always very attentive to the advice they had to offer, and it was a thrill to work with all those legends throughout my years in the sport. But the two people that I really need to thank the most are actually the most influential in my racing career, and they're already in the Hall of Fame. My father, John Falconi, who was inducted into the Hall in 2007, and then from as far back as I can remember, I was at my father's side throughout the mid to late 60s, through the 70s and into the 80s while he owned and operated Westboro and was part of the promoting group at Thompson and Brookline, New Hampshire. I remember going to so many meetings with he and his partners and hearing firsthand about the business and the do's and don'ts of running a racetrack. I really learned the promoting side of racing and just business in general from those guys. And I was my father's sidekick through many seasons of racing. And when he kind of turned the reins over to me in the 80s to pretty much manage the Westboro Speedway, I was most prepared thanks to the man they called Murph. And he's been, of course, the biggest influence to me. But the second huge influence in my career was the legendary Bill Welch, who was inducted into the Hall in 1998. Carl alluded to that. If you didn't have the pleasure of knowing Welchie, you missed a big part of New England racing history. There's a reason why they called him the Dean of New England Auto Racing. He was part of that promoting team with my father and the other guys and brought a sense of fairness and logic from the competitor's point of view. He knew what worked and what didn't, but he never spoke with a raised voice or an angry word. One of the nicest men you would ever know and a mentor to many, several that are in this room here today. But when he wasn't working behind the scenes at these tracks, he was in the forefront of them as an announcer at Westboro, Thompson, Stafford, and Norwood. I was lucky enough to be seated next to Welchie in the Westboro announcer's booth just about every Saturday night of every summer in the mid to late 1960s. And when you sit in the stands at a race, it's rare that you hear the announcer once the green flag drops. But even back then, and way before these races were recorded or streamed on the internet, the announcer, it was still calling every part of the race as if everyone could hear him. So being next to Welchie for all those nights, I got to hear his call word for word. And I learned that the show was only as thrilling as the announcer made it. It was part mechanical information, part expert opinion, part historical, part inside information from knowing the drivers and the pit crews. It was all about being that link between what was happening on the track and the people who paid to watch it. And that's the most important part of what we do, educate the spectators. And I know my colleagues from the announcers' booths all over New England that are here today will agree. And I'll leave you with this thought. There are people like us that go to the races every week and have done so for many years. We know what's happening on the racetrack most of the time, but we're a fading bunch, unfortunately. It's fairly obvious that attendance is shrinking at racetracks everywhere. Any good promoter will tell you that to survive, he needs in the seats as much as he needs cars in the pits. So therefore, we got to make some new fans. And the announcer plays a big role in that. If the first-time fan leaves there not knowing what he or she just saw, what the difference is between the cars, what the flags mean, why they line up the way they do, why they got penalized, what they get for winning, even knowing the drivers' names and hometowns, if that first fan goes away uneducated, they're never coming back. So they'll put up with the paint-peeling grandstands, the $6 hamburger, the layer of dust on their car from the gravel parking lot, if they leave there knowing what they saw and they're excited about it. Because if they learn enough to go home or go to work and tell somebody about racing and speak it like they know it, not only are they coming back, but they're bringing somebody with them. And that's our job. I know I do it every time I open the mic, and I know my colleagues do too. So if you're a promoter, driver, car owner, crew member, give the announcer all the information that you can that he can share with the fans. Anything to help educate the first-timers, the new fans to that racetrack about the sport. We're the link between the show and the spectators, and we're out to make new fans every time we go into the booth. And we do need a lot of new fans. Again, thank you, Neer. Thank you to all the announcers I've worked with, everybody that I've had the pleasure of dealing with in this long racing career. And thank you all very much. This is truly a great honor. God bless you all. Thank you.